Teach you how to use Photoshop's lasso tools to make a fern plant like the one that you see here. Let's go ahead and get started. We're starting off with a blank composition, and I've used the grids to allow me to accurately place the base of the plant. This is the actual pot. I'm using the perspective tools here, and then I'm going to use the warp tool to adjust the shape of the pot to give it some curvature. When we use the guides, it allows us to accurately place the curves so that they look symmetric. We're going to confirm our changes. This is going to be labeled as our base, and we're going to duplicate the base to make the top and bottom lips of the pot. So here you can see that I'm transforming the object, scaling it out a little bit using the transform tool. I'll make a copy of it, Control J, and for this one I'm going to bring it in just a little bit smaller. There we go. And now we have to create the top part of each of those lips. So I'll make a brand new layer for that after I label my top and bottom. So there we go, there's top, there's the bottom, and there's our base. There are three separate parts. So let's go ahead and make the opening for the top. So I'll use black here. Use the lasso or the marquee tool, the elliptical marquee tool, and I will select black, and I will hit Option Delete or Alt Backspace, and I will deselect it with Control D or Command D. Call this hole. Make a copy of it. Move it underneath the base, so that way the hole is being covered by the base pot. And I'll just zoom in to move this into position, and then I'll use my arrow keys to nudge it into place. I'll call this one hole bottom, and I'll call this one hole top. Now we're going to actually create the plant, and I'm using the freeform lasso tool to create some tapered forms like you see here. And I'm holding down the shift key to add to my selection. So what I'm doing is I'm making a series of selections at the topmost layer that taper, and I'll have one that's kind of drooping down, and I will pick a green value and I will fill it in. And I want to make the bottom part of the plant feel like it's actually inside the pot. So I'm going to nudge it down below where it's covering the top of the lip. I'll Control click the top lip and hit Control X to cut it. I'll label this one as foreground, and I'll make a new layer called background. I'll put some additional leaves, and I'll use the same technique as before. And I'll make these of a different color. So again, holding down Shift key, super helpful. Pick a light greener value and move it down. Control click on the top lip and Control X to cut it. And now I'll clean up some of the extra bits, a little residue at the top of using the lasso tool, and I'll fix that tangent. Go up to the foreground layer, clean that one up a little bit too. So I've got all the basic shapes in. Now I'm going to add some of the texture details for the individual leaves, and I'm holding down the lasso tool, using the lasso tool with the Shift key, and I'm making these patterns that are going to be perpendicular to the leaf. so they're all horizontal. And you just sometimes maybe go slow depending upon how many selections you're making at a time. So again, to repeat some old techniques, you're going to make the selections, duplicate them, put them on a separate layer, and then use the hue saturation tool to make the values lighter or darker. So this process is being repeated for all of the leaves. How do I know this? I'm looking at a reference on a separate display, and that reference gives me some insight into the texture that I need to apply for the leaves. And so I'll quickly knock out the last two once I get this one done. Just two more. Trying to keep the selections as thin as possible. I'm using a Cintiq pen to do all of this. You can easily replicate these results with just a mouse. All the techniques that I've shown thus far can be used solely with the mouse. Some things are obviously easier to do with the stylus compared to a mouse, so your mileage may vary. So for these background leaves, I'm making the values a little bit lighter. Always thinking about contrast. So I've got the textures in place. Now I want to add some shading. So this is the first case where I'll actually use a brush, and I'll use a soft round opacity brush, and I will pick kind of a darker version of this beige value, and I'll literally paint. And I'm painting on the layer above that, and you can see how keeping the top, the base, and the bottom separate allows me to have more control over how I'm painting my objects. So now I'll add a little bit of a darker value because I'm having my light source coming from the left. I'll do the same thing for the bottom. And I'm painting that. Do the same thing for the top. The way I'm making those selections is I'm control clicking or command clicking on the thumbnail for the layer itself. And so you can see that the right side now has darker values. I'm going to make my highlights now. My highlights are going to be using a lighter value. So I'll use maybe a whiter version. I need to go a little bit lighter than that. There we go. And that helps give it some form. I'll do the same thing for the bottom part. Make a new layer. Call it highlights. Then I'll go to the base. Control clicking it, making a new layer, called highlights, moving it up. I like to have my highlights higher on the layer stack compared to the shadows. And now I'm going to add some quick textures, you know, to make it look more like clay or terracotta or something like that. So I'll make a new layer for that. And I'll fill the color in. Label that texture, and I'll move this to the very top so you can see it all. I'll drop the opacity. Now I'm going to add some shading to the leaves. So I'll go to the background leaves first, label that layer as shading, use my soft round opacity brush with a darker value of that green to give the leaves a little bit more dimension and form. As we get towards the pot, like the dark parts, there's not going to be as much light, right? So it's going to look darker. And everywhere we have like an intersection between the leaves, I try to create some contrast there too. Now we'll go to the foreground layer, we'll control click it, make a new layer, call it shading as well. Sample a value, choose a dark value. And come back in, we'll paint. We'll maybe extend it up a little bit. This type of movement is very easy to do with a Cintiq pen or a tablet pen compared to doing it by mouse. I'll also get the tips of the leaves as well. And now I'll come back in and I'll paint some highlights. I'm just doing this in the same layer. And there we go. We have this house plant. I'll add some little dots just to kind of give some variation. Things that are organic typically have some variation to it. Do the same thing with the other leaves here, making small rounded circles, very tiny circles, to give it some texture. Control J, Control U, and you can see that that has some texture. So now that I've got all of these layers as separate layers, I want to show you how you can build on this. So I'm going to group everything. I've grouped it into a layer called Plant. I'll make a copy of it by hitting Control J, and I can use a combination of the perspective tool, or I can use the warp tool. So to use the warp tool, I have to actually merge the layers together. So this is like the final step. I'm going to merge them all, and using the warp tool, I can control the shape of the leaves a little bit. And I can use those little blue dots, those are handles for the warp tool, to adjust the shape. This can be useful if you're trying to create a series of plants that are slightly different from one another without being complete carbon copies. And you can also change the hue of the entire thing. Maybe you're building a greenhouse, or maybe you're having a room where you have multiple plants of the same type that are there. So that's how you would do that. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something. We'll see you in the next video.